My name is Kopano Ratele. I'm a professor of psychology here at Stellenbosch University. I'm also the head of an emerging center called the Africa Center for Critical and Creative Thought.
I'm Glenn Adams. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Kansas, where I am also interim director at the Kansas African Studies Center.
I'm here at STIAS working with my collaborator and friend Glenn Adams, here with me, working on a book project on decolonial psychology and well-being.
And the important thing, I think, for the book project is to think about a psychology from an African centering perspective, to think of psychology in general from the African context and experience.
One of the courses I teach at the university is a first year introductory course, Psychology in Context. And I teach a series of lectures on African psychology. What is African psychology? The history of psychology is a history that begins in Europe. So essentially, at heart, psychology is Eurocentric. But at some point, some Europeans left that corner of Asia and went to America. And since the rise of the US empire, psychology has had an American heart. So you have what we call a Euro-American centric psychology. Now, in that context, it makes sense to want to write, do, and practice a psychology from African settings.
One of the most important things that you get from centering Africa in the study of psychology is to understand what decolonial theorists refer to as the coloniality that's inherent in modernity. One of the things about Eurocentric psychology is it takes the modern individualist subject and treats it as a natural form, and then it prescribes that form across the entire globe. And an African centering standpoint helps you to understand that that modern individualist subject is also a colonial product, and that it's a reflection and a reproduction of coloniality. That by doing psychology in that way, you're not only doing a disservice to understanding African settings, but you misunderstand psychology in general in American settings too, as something that reproduces colonial violence.
In the first part of our lecture, we will dedicate it to then elaborating this African-centered decolonial psychology, evading, escaping, circumventing Eurocentric, Euro-American-centric psychology. And the second part will be taken up by Glenn.
One way to understand this project is in terms of themes that have been very prominent in the South African context for a while now. That is, thinking about decolonizing knowledge or decolonizing the university. And the way we will discuss it in the presentation is to think about racism in academic racism or intellectual racism. Many times we think about intellectual racism as the propagation of ideas that are explicitly racist, or maybe cases of imposing knowledge from outside on an African context. But we see the racism or epistemic violence, if you will, of these kind of modern colonial Eurocentric psychology and being its very existence in the European centers of knowledge. And we'll illustrate this with the discussion of racism, but also with the discussion of well-being. Existing models of well-being in the field of psychology tend to emphasize a kind of high arousal happiness, so a personal fulfillment or expansion that's centered really on a kind of actualization of the self. And we draw on work in African settings that illuminates a different kind of well-being, a more sustainable kind of well-being that instead of emphasizing the expansion of people towards some kind of possibilities is more concerned with a livable life for a broader number of people.